You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hello again, good listeners. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane for June 3rd, 2016. We are coming to you this week from the Walt Whitman Studios, located somewhere outside of Boston, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook and Twitter, where I tweet as In the Past Lane. And of course, we'd love it if you headed over to iTunes and subscribe to the In the Past Lane podcast. Better still, subscribe and then leave a short review. Thanks. The captain of our ship is, as always, our brilliant executive producer, Lulu Spencer. So what's the deal this week at In the Past Lane? Well, it's June, and June, as you no doubt know, is Pride Month, the month that commemorates the struggle for gay rights, or as it's more properly known these days, LGBT rights. So with that in mind, this episode of In the Past Lane will take up the history of this struggle. First, I'll present a short piece on the notion of hidden or forgotten history. Next, I'll speak with Andrew Berman, the executive director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, about the campaign to get the Obama administration to designate the famous Stonewall Inn as a historic national monument. He has some very interesting things to say, not only about Stonewall, but also about the making and remaking of history. And third, I interview historian Jim Downs about his extraordinary new book, Stand By Me, The Forgotten History of Gay Liberation. I'm willing to bet he'll change the way you think about the history of LGBT people and their struggle for equal rights. Okay, people, polish up those sunglasses. Your journey in the past lane begins now. Why is it so important to have a history? For nations, the answer to this question seems obvious. A country needs a history and needs to be aware of its history because it's the basis of its identity. A nation's history helps explain to its citizens what it is, what it stands for. A history provides stories of triumph and glory, of tragedy and redemption, of progress and accomplishment. A history also provides heroes and role models. And it should also include failures and dark chapters that can teach valuable lessons. These kinds of national histories date to the very origins of historical writing by the ancient Greeks, people like Thucydides and Herodotus. But what about the histories of smaller communities of people on the margins, people with little or no political power, of people who don't seem to matter, immigrants, for example, or factory workers? Well, if you posed this question in a history class, say back in 1960, it's very likely that your query would have been met with amusement. In the same way, if you searched a standard college or high school history textbook for the history of Native Americans or African Americans or women, you'd come up with next to nothing. Now, does that mean that they didn't have a history? That certainly was the view held by many before 1960. This attitude calls to mind the experience of Arthur Schomburg. Schomburg was born in 1874 in Puerto Rico to a German father and a mother of African heritage. When he was in middle school, he informed his teacher that he wanted to write a report on the history of Africans and people of African descent. The teacher looked at Schomburg and said to him, "Black people have no history. No history, no accomplishments, and no heroes." This incident left an indelible mark on Schomburg, and he vowed that he would one day research and gather and write about the history of Africans throughout the world. And so he did. Decades later, in 1926, and now living in the United States, Schomburg sold to the New York Public Library one of the world's largest collections of African history. A huge trove of books, documents, letters, diaries, music, folklore, artifacts and artwork, and so on. It turns out, blacks did have a history. And it was right there in plain sight. That truth has become more and more evident in the 9 decades since 1926. Today, there are tens of thousands of books on African, Afro-Caribbean, and African American history. Countless museums, documentaries, and historical markers tell the story of the African American experience in the United States. And this September, the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture will open on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And this transformation is not just true for African Americans. If we look around the United States, we also find countless books, museums, historical markers, statues, documentaries, and more that tell the history of women, immigrants, workers, Native Americans, and so on. What I'm talking about here is called social history, or as some people like to call it, history from the bottom up. It's an approach to history that became increasingly popular after 1960. Instead of focusing on wars and elections, on presidents and industrialists, essentially the history of rich and powerful men, social history has focused its attention on the history of everyday people, especially people without wealth, political power, or status in mainstream society. How did enslaved people build a culture that resisted the depredations of slavery? How did women who lacked the vote nonetheless find ways to exert political influence? How did factory workers resist and challenge laissez-faire capitalism? Since 1960, these kinds of social history studies have revolutionized the field of history and the way Americans understand their country and its past. But it's really important to point out that the social history revolution did not occur solely because some historians decided to go in that direction. One crucial factor was that people within these marginalized and underrepresented groups began to demand that their history be recognized. And in many cases, they began to research and write their own history, just like Arthur Schomburg, long before the academic historians and museums got involved. So, you're wondering, what does this have to do with LGBT history? The focus of this week's episode. Well, as you'll see in our next 2 segments, it has everything to do with LGBT history. Discovering and writing this history became an essential part of the LGBT struggle for civil rights and inclusion in the great American narrative. We'll be right back. Hey Lulu, which button is it that I hit again to start the interview?
We went over this in production.
Okay, we're back. With me now is Andrew Berman. Andrew is Executive Director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation in New York City. And I've asked Andrew to join us here at In the Past Lane to talk about the recent news coming out of Washington, D.C., that President Obama is planning to name the Stonewall Inn a national monument. Stonewall, of course, is located in New York's Greenwich Village, and it's widely seen as the birthplace of the modern gay rights movement. So if the rumors are true, Stonewall will become the nation's first LGBT monument. Andrew Berman, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Perhaps the best way to start off is to have you maybe give us a quick 101 overview of the story of the Stonewall Inn and what happened on that night in late June 1969.
Well, the Stonewall Inn was a mafia-owned and run gay bar in Greenwich Village, which at the time, many, if not most, gay bars in Greenwich Village and across the country were typically owned by the mob, partly because they were de facto illegal, which meant that they were, for the most part, not great places to go. They were constantly the subject of police harassment and raids, and people could be arrested simply for being there. Oftentimes their names were printed in the paper, their lives were ruined. So these were difficult, challenging places and a difficult and challenging time. Basically, what happened over the course of 3 nights in late June is when one of these, what would have otherwise been routine raids of this bar, located in the heart of Greenwich Village, which by this point had become a real mecca for gay people, when the police raided the bar, really for the first time, the patrons actually fought back, physically and otherwise. And they routed the police, in fact, and the police actually had to barricade themselves into the bar to protect themselves from the angry mob. And over the course of the next 2 nights, crowds gathered and continued to demonstrate, and there was this very vocal outpouring of anger and protest against this constant state of police harassment which took place. And for a lot of people, it was really a psychological shot across the bow, especially during this time of great radical change. It really helped lead to a dramatic shift in the direction of what was then referred to as the gay rights movement, which up to that point had been very, very subtle, low-key, polite for the most part in its efforts, picketing by people who had to wear suits and ties or dresses and look beyond reproach and to sort of politely ask for changes in laws and things of that nature, to a much more militant grassroots effort. And in some ways, most importantly, what happened from there was on an annual basis, the date of these riots became an anniversary that was marked, a celebration, a rallying point. And this really kept the memory of this event alive to the point where today, in cities and places literally across the globe, every year the anniversary of those protests, those riots, that uprising, whatever you want to call it, is marked and celebrated and is a symbol of the fight against anti-LGBT oppression.
It seems like it, to use a modern term, it was a real tipping point. It really transformed the style of activism. And what's interesting is that it was a very big moment within the LGBT community, but to outsiders, it was simply just a strange disturbance in Greenwich Village. But on the ground in LGBT communities across the country, it really made a lot of headlines. People kept talking about it. And as you point out, just 1 year later, on the first anniversary, we see the first commemorations of this moment. So they're very aware that something different has happened and that they're heading in a different direction.
That's absolutely true. And, I think one of the most powerful things that this really speaks to is that history is not something that is written in stone and that will just, left to its own devices, be told and told in one indisputable way. People made sure that the story of what happened there was remembered, that its significance was pointed to, and that it became a rallying point and a rallying cry. This is an event which received very, very minor and, for the most part, somewhat derogatory and demeaning coverage in the press at the time. So it could have easily been forgotten and certainly not thought of as a great and significant event or a turning point in history. But it was really the activists and advocates who said, this is an important, groundbreaking event. It's one that we are going to constantly point to and to use as our inspiration, as our Alamo, as our never forget moment. And that's what helped turn it into, almost 50 years later, a place that's mentioned in speeches by the President of the United States and hopefully on its way to becoming a national monument.
That's right. So maybe tell us a little bit about this evolution of the site. It's already achieved a number of important historic landmark or preservation statuses, and this latest one in the works is probably going to be the biggest of all. So how was Stonewall preserved and what's its status now? And then maybe you could talk a little bit about the importance of this naming of it as a national monument.
Sure. Well, really the first kind of formal preservation and recognition effort was in 1999 when the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, along with a group called the Organization of Lesbian and Gay Architects and Designers, successfully nominated it for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. This was the first time that any site anywhere in the country had ever been listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which is a list that's kept by the federal government of historically significant sites. There's tens, if not hundreds of thousands of them across the country. This was the first one ever listed for its connection to what was at the time referred to as gay and lesbian rights. And we would now say LGBT rights, because certainly transgender people were a very big part of what happened at Stonewall. And so for a long time, that was the only site listed on the National Register of Historic Places. for connection to LGBT history. In recent years, there have been a few additions. So in 99, it was listed. In 2000, it was elevated to the next highest level, designated a National Historic Landmark. And both of these afford things like tax breaks and things like that for helping to preserve or restore these sites, but it doesn't actually mandate their preservation. GVSHP, the Greenwich Village Society, we spearheaded an effort to get New York City to landmark the site, which, though this is somewhat counterintuitive, it's actually local landmark designation that is much stronger in terms of requiring the preservation of the site as opposed to federal designation, which is really mostly honorific and provides incentives but not mandates. So last year we were able to get the city finally, after years of resistance, to landmark Stonewall, and now with an effort being spearheaded by the National Parks Conservation Association, it looks as though President Obama and the National Park Service is poised to name Stonewall and the surrounding area, the park that was a center of the protests and the riots, the surrounding streets, as a National Historic Monument. And this would be the first time ever that's been done based upon LGBT history and civil rights.
Right. So if that all comes to pass, you really can't miss it, because it's not going to be just simply a plaque on a small brick building. It'll be a whole area in front, which is this triangular park called Christopher Park. So how will that work?
Well, that's very much to be determined. You know, it could be as little as that simply the signage on the park and the surrounding area, instead of being a New York City Parks Department sign, would have a National Parks Service sign, and there would be information on the National Park Service website and things of that nature. It could, over time, evolve into something more substantial in terms of, you know, whether it's guided tours run by the federal government or other kinds of programming. I mean, the federal government will take possession of this small triangular park in front of the Stonewall, and they will be in charge of the management. For the most part, it physically won't change any. There currently are these statues in there that were placed there in the late 1990s called Gay Liberation, and it's basically a statue of a male couple and a female couple in the park. Those will remain there. So it will very much be a work in progress in terms of what will happen. And from the local perspective, in a lot of ways, the fact that not much will change is good news, because we like a lot about the way that it is. But it will provide potentially more resources, more attention, and most importantly, more education about the historic significance of this place. And it will put the federal government in the role of being able to interpret and tell the story of the events that happened here and their significance in connection to the kind of broader story of American history.
And possibly a museum?
That could be somewhere down the road. You know, there's definitely been some talk, somewhat separate from this, but obviously the two could eventually connect, about there being an LGBT history museum somewhere in New York. As I understand, that's very much in the sort of germination stage, but obviously somewhere around here would be an ideal location, though not potentially the only one. So there are all sorts of possibilities, but right now the real change will simply be the designation and the opportunity for the federal government to join in with the education and interpretation of the historic significance of the site, so that its story is very much recognized as part of the American story and is there for people to engage and appreciate.
Very interesting. And I guess a great example, as you pointed out, of history expanding and including more people. We often think of history sometimes as a script, but there's always opportunities to expand it to include different people, different voices, different experiences. And with the federal stamp of approval, that really marks a significant change.
Absolutely. Yeah, it does speak to our sort of kind of expanding understanding of our history. And it really, I think, speaks to the effort of, most importantly, the people who were there over the course of those 3 nights who participated in those events, and then the thousands and then millions of people over the years since then who have taken it upon themselves to say that this is an important site, this is an important event. I was born in 1969, so I've grown up entirely in this era, and it's very clear to me that the popular understanding of, knowledge of, conception of, just awareness of Stonewall has changed dramatically in the course of my lifetime, and that's really because of a lot of people who worked very hard to highlight and celebrate its importance and to make it a part of its history. It didn't just become part of our history because it naturally would have no matter what. This was a concerted effort, and that's really what all history is. History is written by people, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do everything we can to make sure that history is as accurate and inclusive as possible.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your time. This has been very interesting and very exciting from a historical perspective to see new stories being told.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Andrew Berman is Executive Director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation in New York City. We'll be right back.
We, the people, declare today that the most evident of truths, that all of us are created equal, is the star that guides us still. Just as it guided our forebears through Seneca Falls and Selma and Stonewall, just as it guided all those men and women, sung and unsung, who left footprints along this great mall, to hear a preacher say that we cannot walk alone, to hear a king proclaim that our individual freedom is inextricably bound to the freedom of every soul on earth.
You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
With me now is historian Jim Downs. Jim is an associate professor of history at Connecticut College. He is the author of a number of books, including Sick from Freedom, African American Illness and Suffering During the Civil War and Reconstruction, and most recently, and the book we want to talk about today, Stand By Me, The Forgotten History of Gay Liberation. Jim Downs, thank you for speaking with me today at In the Past Lane.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. I think the best place to start when talking about your book is to start with the subtitle, although I do want to talk about the title as well. But the subtitle is The Forgotten History of Gay Liberation. And so you're starting out, and very clear in your intentions in this book, to challenge the popular narrative about what gay life in America was like in the 1970s, sort of in the post-Stonewall era. So what is that sort of dominant traditional narrative, and what's wrong with it? What needs to be corrected, or what needs to be added?
Sure. So basically, the story of gay liberation begins, as you say, with the Stonewall Uprising, which is a moment when gay people rebel against a police raid. And what it does is it unleashes this major political revolution in which LGBT people begin fighting more vigorously for political rights, for the end of discriminatory legislation, for equality in the workplace. And this is a sort of story that many other social movements mimic throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century in the United States. But the way in which the gay liberation movement departs from these other movements about political mobilization is largely to the effect that the 1970s also ushered in a major sexual revolution. So the popular image of the 70s often is of gay men having lots of sex, gay men going to discos, gay men going to bathhouses, gay men going to bars. And so much of that is definitely a major feature and a major hallmark of the period. But what I uncovered is that so much of that story was actually told and retold in order to explain the outbreak of HIV. When HIV broke out in the early part of the 1980s, it flummoxed medical professionals, journalists, and the gay community. And so they couldn't understand how this sexually transmitted virus spread so rapidly and so violently. And so they turned to the 1970s and to the sexual libertine culture, and they began to sort of argue about the ways in which that world of sex helped to spread the epidemic. Now, there's a biomedical explanation for it that doesn't necessarily jive with that claim. But in history, what it did was it took the richness, the diversity, the nuance and detail of the period, and it flattened it out to only one note, to only being about sex. So the subtitle derived from my effort to reclaim the other major part of the 1970s, and so that for people living in the 1970s without an awareness of what was going to happen in the 1980s and later with HIV, they saw the gay liberation movement as an intellectual revolution, as an opportunity to begin newspapers, to start churches. And really, it was an intellectual revolution because to think about it, gay people had to think themselves out of the constraints of what it meant to be gay. The medical profession said they were aberrant, so they had to rethink that idea that they weren't aberrant. The religious community thought that they were sinners, so they had to rethink that. And as a result, what they did, and I mentioned this in various characters in the book, they understood that they were oppressed. Now, you might just think, well, that's kind of obvious, or that's, basic, but to them, that distinction between being oppressed versus being a medical aberrant was very crucial. And once they made that distinction, that fueled this intellectual revolution, and that allowed them in many ways to sort of begin developing other parts of the culture, which I think have been since overshadowed, if not entirely forgotten.
Right, sort of overshadowed by what you refer to, I think, a couple times as the 3 Bs, the bars, the baths, and the beaches.
Right.
As sort of the way in which people understood, especially after the AIDS epidemic, the way that people understood what gay life, quote unquote, was all about. And your book really does a phenomenal job of really peeling back the layers from the 1980s and beyond to see what was really happening in the 1970s and really seeing this intellectual fermentation, this cultural fermentation, and community building. It's really a multi-pronged effort. And there were some real big surprises. I have to say, I was really surprised about how big a role religion played in this story. Because if you think in the sort of shorthand version of this story, and you think about the history of gay liberation, a lot of it is rage at religion. Understandable rage at religion. You've rejected me, I reject you. Yet, the Metropolitan Community Church, maybe we could tell us a little bit more about this unique organization and the remarkable role that it played in this story.
Right. So just to pick up on what you said, I mean, the traditional narrative, again, is that churches and religious institutions oppress gay people, and so the part of the liberation narrative was breaking free from those places instead of running toward them. And what I uncovered in reading through the newspapers, you pick up any paper from the 1970s that's LGBT founded, you're going to find something about religion, whether it's a reference to the meeting of the Metropolitan Community Church or another group. It literally just dominated the way people thought and understood this period. And so what happened is a year or two before the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, a group of gay people organized in Los Angeles, and they create the Metropolitan Community Church in response to the fact that traditional denominations and traditional religion did not accept them. And immediately, the MCC, the Metropolitan Community Church, is the first ever church created by and for gay people. It spread around the world. And so chapters opened up throughout the United States. And what I found fascinating was that in big urban centers, New York, San Francisco, Boston, Philadelphia, you might have 1 or 2 gay bars. But in places where you couldn't have a gay bar, you could have a gay church. And these churches weren't necessarily like Gothic buildings or, they could just be a congregation that formed in the basement of a traditional church or in someone's home, often sometimes at a community center, any place where they could find some refuge. They would organize a church and they would organize a congregation. And it was often a way for LGBT people to come together. And it was a way for both men and women to come together, which was also important because bar culture segregated men from women and religious culture brought them together.
And what were some of the ministries that they took up? And what did the work of these churches, they had services, but a lot of what they did were, I guess in a traditional church setting, you would call ministries, outreach programs.
Right. So one of the things is that they really tried to sort of overturn the idea that being gay and being a person of faith were antithetical to each other. And so they also, which is the other important point too, that bars couldn't do, they encouraged people to come out. They encouraged people to embrace their faith. They provided them with readings from the Bible and readings from various forms of scripture, readings from other kinds of religious texts depending on their denomination, to help them ease the transition to their full identity as a person of faith and as also a gay person.
Which must have counted for a lot for many folks, given their own personal history with religion, which was probably pretty fraught up until that point.
Yeah, it really offered them a sense of community and culture. Because once these organizations like the MCC started to grow, or the group Dignity that was founded by Catholics, or Integrity founded by Episcopalians, once they started to grow, they all had newsletters, because this was an age before, obviously, the internet and other forms of social media. So they published these newsletters, and in them they would talk about, where do you go to meet people? How can we find people? How can we find people that are like us? How can we create a sense of community outside of the party world? In other words, one of the things I'm trying not to do is to create a major distinction to say that, okay, there were the guys that went to church and there were the guys that went to the club and they're two separate guys. No, there's definitely some that only did one or the other, but there are many that did both. But we have to realize that, bars and clubs and even bathhouses were only open at certain points in time. And people wanted more than just sex. They definitely want to go out. They definitely wanted to party. But they also wanted a sense of community. They wanted a sense of culture. And the religious groups fostered that. They were human beings who were complex individuals just like straight people.
Right.
In terms of wanting to have both and wanting to have different aspects of their lives. And I think that the image that comes down to us from history is either we see them marching in these sweaty political struggles, demanding rights, or we see them having a good time at a disco, and we don't see what actually allowed them to create a sense of community and culture. What was the foundation for that? I think today, when young people come out, they just assume there's going to be a gay bar, a gay restaurant, a gay newspaper, a gay group. But no. These are not these timeless sort of artifacts that are just, obvious in culture. They developed at a certain time because people believe in the necessity to actually build a culture.
Right. As you say, this building process really begins in the 1970s, and it reflects, as you say, the fact that people are not one-dimensional. And honestly, spending every waking moment in a disco sounds just exhausting.
Right.
I think you quote somebody in one part where somebody said, yeah, gay people like straight people also want quiet, congenial places where you can sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk with people in a much more relaxed kind of setting. And one thing I don't want to overlook is the fact that the MCC, the Metropolitan Community Church, was at the center of a pretty dramatic story that you tell right out of the gate, which is the incident in New Orleans in June of 1973. Maybe you could tell us about the Upstairs Lounge Massacre.
Right. So what happens is a group in New Orleans forms, and they decide to have a chapter of the Metropolitan Community Church, but they can't find a place to meet. So the Upstairs Lounge is this brand new bar. And so the Upstairs Lounge says, yeah, you could have your meetings on Sunday nights here. And so on June 24th, 1973, a group of people go to the Upstairs Lounge first to celebrate the 4th anniversary of Stonewall, which I thought was interesting. The news of the Stonewall uprising made its way to New Orleans, and they're going to have a huge happy hour that Sunday afternoon to celebrate it. And then by the time early evening comes, the happy hour ends, and members of the Metropolitan Community Church come to meet on the second floor of this bar. And what happens is the first floor of the bar is a straight bar. The second floor is the Upstairs Lounge. And so on the second floor, they're there, and they are singing spiritual songs. And it's New Orleans in the early part of the 70s, and this part of the neighborhood's changing. So the windows are still barricaded, and the doors are all locked. The only way anyone can get in is if you buzz on the street level, and then you kind of walk up this back alley staircase, and there's a hatch sort of modeled after a Prohibition speakeasy, and the person sort of slides open the hatch and sees who's there and lets you in or not. So the buzzer kept ringing, and the bartender said, you know what, I don't know who that is. Like, there's no one here. No one called for a taxi. Ignore it. Then a couple minutes pass, and it rings again. This time, the bartender motions to someone standing by the door to open it, and when he does, a fire explodes. Someone threw a Molotov cocktail onto the steps leading into the upstairs lounge, and within a couple of seconds, I mean, it was an old building, it's wooden, the place just went up in flames. And many of the gay men immediately ran to the windows, and they tried to get out the windows, but the windows were barricaded. And then the bartender started to call them to go towards the back of the bar, where he knew of an exit that would lead to a roof. But as soon as he makes the call, the power goes out in the building. It's completely black. Everyone's choking on smoke. They were stuck in there. The fire department eventually comes. Some people manage to escape out the back way. Some of the thinner guys miraculously managed to squeeze their body through the bars. And a couple of them made it, but over 32 people died. They died. Their bodies are found under the piano. Their bodies are found in the bathroom. Their bodies are found piled up on each other. The one story that stuck with me, and it got picked up by the Times-Picayune and by others, is the Reverend William Larson goes to one of the windows, and he wedges his body through this narrow space. And as he does, the tourists across the street are now gathering on the pavement. They're seeing him. They're seeing other people. They're yelling for him to jump. And he's trying to push his body through, and he can't get his body through. And then the building is starting to disintegrate, and the air conditioner on the third floor drops on him and kills him. And his body is actually left in the window for over a day. And so there was a real stereotype of not wanting to touch gay men, just sort of ignoring them, not feeling their pain. The news reports, the media, how they reported on it was often very derogatory. How people in the local culture talked about it was often very discriminatory. And so it's really a huge tragedy, and it is what I call in the first chapter the largest massacre of gay people in U.S. history.
Right, and one that you say has never been solved, even though it's 40 years since the tragedy. And I think in that one part of the story, the Reverend's body being wedged into that window and left there for 24 hours really, I think in some ways, explains the incredibly marginalized status of gay Americans at that point.
Right.
The fire department, the police department could do that, and knowing there's no recriminations. In the same way that journalists could write snickery, snarky things, and people could tell jokes about it, and there's no social penalty, no political penalty whatsoever at that time. It's a very different world.
Correct. And what's interesting, too, is that the founder of the Metropolitan Community Church, Troy Perry, hears about the fire immediately after, and he flies immediately he was in Los Angeles, and he flies to New Orleans, and he starts demanding a thorough police investigation, a fire investigation. He holds press conferences. He organizes a memorial for those who passed. And one of the other pieces about this is that it really helped to galvanize the LGBT community in New Orleans, because Reverend Troy Perry had this memorial service, and he wanted to see this tragedy as a way to sort of create awareness about the oppression of gay people. And I think that in the back of his mind was obviously the Black Civil Rights Movement and the church burnings there. And the thing that I mentioned in my book that I think this is the original piece of the research that others haven't talked about, the fire against the church in New Orleans was not the only one. Other gay churches at this time were, in fact, targets of arson. So when Troy Perry leaves Los Angeles in June, he had already seen an attack on his church that previous January. Churches in San Diego were hit, in Nashville and other places, all within 1973 and 1974. The other historians and other people who want to talk about the fire, they're very invested in this question of who did it. I'm less interested in that and more interested in placing the fire within a broader historical context that shows it's not the only one.
Right.
It's part of a larger history of violence committed against gay people in the 1970s that's often not told. again, because of the image of the sex-fueled 70s, the political mobilization of the 70s, we fail to see these horrific moments of violence committed against gay people.
I mean, it's a really remarkable chapter, and as you point out, it's something that ought to be known, and it also played a key role within the community. So it could be something that was left the front page of the newspapers, if it ever got there, pretty quickly, and fell out of mainstream public discourse. But for the LGBT community, it is an important moment. It's a galvanizing moment, one of many that really forms a part of this emerging culture that you're talking about. And another thing that I found really fascinating is the role of history. You talk a lot about the role that newspapers play and publications play in creating this community and this culture. And a subset of that is the great search for, I guess you could call it the great search for gay history that is found within these pages on a regular basis. Columns, feature pieces, and ultimately people writing books about the role of LGBT people in history and many aspects of it as part of telling people that they are people. Because, of course, people have history.
Right. So there's a couple of different things. I mean, part of it was that the creation of gay history and the descent into both gay culture and into academic work coincided with other movements that fall under the rubric of the usable past. So that Black history, women's history, all in the 1970s too, like gay history, were searching for antecedents. Were looking for histories of their predecessors in order to locate their own struggle, to say that what we're fighting for is not necessarily a brand new phenomenon, but it's part of this larger trajectory, this larger history. The other piece of it too, which was really fascinating to me, I interviewed Jim Stakely, who was a scholar of German studies at University of Wisconsin in Madison for many decades, and he broke the first stories about the Nazi persecution of homosexuals during World War II. I mean, there was a pamphlet published in the 70s, and then he wrote his own newspaper articles about it in The Body Politic, which was a gay newspaper that came out of Toronto. And when I talked to him, I was like, well, wait, why did you do this? Why? Besides, it's fascinating. So I'm like, what? And he said, because part of showing people what it meant to be gay was to sort of provide ample evidence that we were oppressed, because people didn't buy it. I think this is also about the stereotype, because what people saw was this happy disco stereotype, and what they were trying to do was marshal an argument about oppression. And so turning to the past was a way to do that. The other part of it was when they plucked out people like Oscar Wilde or Hart Crane or Walt Whitman or Amy Lowell, many other kinds of writers. It was about showing gay people that they had a shared history, that what's going to connect these people besides their sexual proclivities, besides what they do in bed. We have a culture. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, in order to create a vernacular, in order to create a kind of connection, you put forward a history. We have a history. See, our history is a way to connect us. So it was also, while Stakely, I think, was right and was invested in writing history in order to marshal evidence about oppression to prove to, straight people how difficult it was to be gay, other efforts to reclaim the gay past were not about introducing any of this information to straight people. Like, yes, it's interesting if they want to read it, fine, they can read it. But it was more about them creating a sense of community and culture for themselves. They had a shared vocabulary, a shared identity, a shared sense of heritage that would help them create a closer-knit community.
Yeah, it's interesting. That seems to me to be somewhat of a unique dimension to it, because you do see in other liberation movements, early African-American liberation movements in the late 19th and early 20th century, just to cite one example, one of the big elements of that was to discover all the important figures in African-American history who were assisting George Washington, who were inventing things, who were playing these important roles, and say that we were there too, we've contributed to the building up of the Republic, therefore we're legitimate, we deserve rights. And to some extent that has an internal purpose, but it's mostly, 90% of it is aimed at convincing the majority society that they belong and that they've contributed. Whereas with this LGBT history, it seems it's I don't know what percentage you would give it, but a lot of it has to do with internal consumption and building the community for community development, community consumption.
Right, because the ways I always think about it is like when it comes to Black history, even though many Black people historically were denied their history through school curricula or recognition through the culture, and I could say this as an African American historian, they found their history in their community, among their family members, among members of their church, in their neighborhoods. So that obviously that history never makes it into the textbook, or it wasn't part of a national memory, but among themselves, they know. Whereas for gay people growing up in families that don't know anything about being gay, that dismiss homosexuality, that see it as a disorder, there's nothing. So thereby, it's like that role the family plays or community plays, gay people don't have that as young people coming up. So as a result, it's like it plays a much more significant role as they come out of the closet, as they move into various neighborhoods and create certain enclaves. Like there's this need almost to have something that binds them together. And then there's a debate later in the 1980s, 90s, even today. Oh, I'm just like everybody else. I'm not separate. I don't need my own history. So there was a way that looking for their own history was also very political because it was showing difference and embracing that difference. Whereas I think today there's this understanding of we're not different. You know, I'm going to live in the same neighborhood as everybody else. I'm going to go to the same bars. I'm going to do everything. I'm not different. You know, so then people aren't reaching. They don't need a history that says they're different. In fact, they would almost like reject it.
Right. I think that we see parallels there as well with other movements when they reach a certain point of success, if you want to call it that. There is a certain tendency among some people to say, well, we're done. We don't need it. I mean, the way in which people have walked away from the word feminism in recent years is in some ways somewhat similar. All right. Well, Jim, this has been great. Thank you for spending an afternoon with In the Past Lane. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Jim Downs is an associate professor of history at Connecticut College. He is the author of a number of books, including Sick from Freedom, African American Illness and Suffering During the Civil War and Reconstruction, and most recently, Stand By Me, The Forgotten History of Gay Liberation, which is out now from Basic Books. So there you have it, people. Like we always say here at In the Past Lane, history is not just about the past. It's about us, here and now. History has power and influence in the here and now. That's why we're always fighting and always arguing over it. And that's why people who are excluded from the mainstream American narrative struggle to write their history, to tell it, to proclaim it, to demand that it be taken seriously. Because they know history matters. Well, people, that's going to do it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully, we've given you something to think about. If so, please head over to Twitter or our Facebook page to leave us your comments, questions, and suggestions. I also encourage you to head over to our website, inthepastlane.com, where you'll find a show page for this episode that includes links, essays, images, and further reading suggestions related to everything we've discussed in this episode. At inthepastlane.com, you can also learn more about our guests, correspondents, and other contributors. And people, you know the deal. It really helps the In the Past Lane podcast when loyal listeners like you subscribe to it at iTunes or Stitcher. And of course, please leave a review. Thanks. Lots of great people make In the Past Lane possible. They include technical advisors Holly Hunt and Jesse Anderson, podcasting consultant Daryl Darnell of Pro Podcast Solutions, photographer John Buckingham, graphic designer Maggie Salucci, website by ERI Design, legal services by Tippecanoe and Tyler 2, social media by The Pony Express, risk assessment by Little Bighorn Associates, growth strategies by 5440 or Fight. And of course, we'd be nowhere without her, executive producer Lulu Spencer. Special thanks also to Jay Graham for creating the intro music for this podcast. and to the Free Music Archive for providing the rest of the music for this episode. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world, so let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next week for another journey in the past lane. Hey, Lulu, got any big plans for summer?
Are you talking to me?
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.